Morning, everybody. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Nathan Gibson, who is a senior research associate at Ludwig Maximilian University at Munich. He earned his PhD in 2015 at the Catholic University of America with a thesis on al-Jāḥiẓ and the profile of Christian Abbasid society in the Refutation of Christians. Before coming to Munich, he worked as a research assistant at the Catholic University of America at Baḥr. His research focuses on communication and knowledge exchanges between Muslim, Christians, and Jewish communities in the Middle East, but he is also very engaged in digital humanities, and in that he cooperated, for instance, with the Biblia Arabica team or with circa.org. Nathan Gibson is also the PI of the project Communities of Knowledge, interreligious network of scholars in Ibn al-Uzayba's History of the Physicians. And if you want to see the results of this project, you can take a look at the website uzayba.net. And amongst his publication, I would like to mention the forthcoming volume, Polemic, Power and Popular Opinion, al-Jāḥiẓ Social Argumentation on Muslim-Christian Encounter in Abbasid Iraq. Today, Nathan Gibson will present a paper entitled Circumnavigating Jewish and Christian Realities, what the polemicist al-Jāḥiẓ didn't want to admit about his society. Nathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I feel very privileged to be here. And let me just send in the chat here the link to the slides that I'll be showing so that you can go through them also at your own pace. I'll share my screen here, and then we'll be off. So, all right, can you see that? Great. So, as you know, we're talking today about the Refutation of Christians, sometimes called the Refutation of Christians and Jews by ʿUthmān ʿAmr bin Baḥr al-Jāḥiẓ, very well known for his prose writings in the 9th century, especially Animals, Misers, and other works. But he also wrote quite a number of epistles, risāla, and this is one of them. So let me just set the stage a little bit. Al-Jāḥiẓ was probably in his 70s or so at the time that he wrote this work, and he was navigating some very tricky political currents. According to my best estimation, this was during the early reign of al-Mutawakkil, and we all know about al-Mutawakkil's reversal of the Mihna, so his stance that became anti-Mutazilite, whereas the Mutazilites had been favored previously to that. It's a little bit of debate about exactly how and to what extent that happened, but in any case, the political currents seem to have changed, and al-Jāḥiẓ found himself as a Mutazilite in a more hostile environment. But maybe more importantly, by this time, his two main patrons, who had been strong administrators in the previous caliph, his two patrons were now dead. They were persecuted, you could say, for political reasons, possibly also ideological reasons. And here he is in his 70s, a well-known writer, but without a patron. And as he says, according to one report, he did not want to become the second of two, referring to his patron who was tortured and executed. Well, as it turns out, we have a letter from the close friend of al-Mutawakkil, the administrator al-Fath ibn Haqqan, to al-Jāḥiẓ, saying, please finish up the refutation of Christians, and you're going to be paid your salary, including back payments. He says also that he read the title or preface, not really sure, of this work to the caliph, and that the caliph approved of it. So at this point, he seems to have been working on the refutation of Christians. There's some question about whether this is the same work, but I think it is the same work that has survived. And al-Jāḥiẓ had quite an interesting task then at this point, because we have not only the ideological issues of writing against Christians, but also the personal and political issues. And when we follow the careers of his previous patrons, as well as then his current patron, Al-Fath ibn Haqqan, we see quite some fireworks sometimes between them and particularly the highly placed Christian physicians in the caliph's administration. So what al-Jāḥiẓ needed to do then was not simply to invalidate their beliefs, because of course, someone who maybe has the wrong views can still be the physician to a caliph or an administrator or a eunuch in the caliph's household or the concubine of the caliph and so on, not just to invalidate their ideological religious views, but also to undermine their very credibility. And how do you do this when there are so many highly placed people right in the caliph's orbit? That is one of the problems. But then for us, in interpreting this polemic, there's another problem. This is a historical problem, and that is, what do we do with polemic as a historical source? Obviously, we have a case of obvious and massive bias, but also this polemic provides a lot of rich social detail. So what do we glean from that? How can we actually glean something from that? Well, the solution to that is tied together with al-Jāḥiẓ's solution to his problem. So al-Jāḥiẓ decided to approach this by explicitly undermining these pro-Christian biases, by mentioning them and then attempting to undermine them, and even more significantly, by trying to take these factors that seemed to be in Christians' favor and flipping them around and turning this admiration to disdain. This means that in his rhetoric, in his argumentation, he's making certain maneuvers that we can track. And that's what we need to do to derive some historical value from this. But then the question is, of course, how do we do that? When al-Jāḥiẓ, for example, mentions things like Christians' eating habits, or their sexual mores, or their perceived philosophical expertise, or their social standing, how do we contextualize those? How do we recognize what, for his audience, were facts on the ground, or humorous exaggerations, or simply something the author invented? And for me, the answer to this is argumentation analysis. So particularly, I take the pragma-dialectical approach pioneered by ʿAmr and Butenhorst and others. And what this approach does is it's really an inductive, descriptive approach. So instead of imposing a foreign framework on this, like saying argumentation has to be syllogistic, for example, the attempt is to expose the argumentation in a descriptive way. I want to understand how al-Jāḥiẓ has constructed his arguments without necessarily evaluating the soundness of those arguments. And so the diagrams that I'm about to show you in a bit that come out of this analysis, they seem deceptively simple, but they also actually hide a mammoth task that results in two concrete benefits. This task that they hide is this hermeneutic work of bridging across 12 centuries from now to then to try and understand what al-Jāḥiẓ intended his audience to understand. And it's a little bit equivalent to trying to determine the course that he took steering his boat down the river based on sightings of it at particular points. The concrete benefits that result from this, in my view, are, number one, the argumentation's logical structure that we see revealed. Sorry, not ready for that yet. And the fact that it reveals these implicit elements, that we have a methodology for trying to make explicit these implicit elements in his argument. Now, that's quite convoluted, especially in the case of somebody like al-Jāḥiẓ, because we're talking about a literary work that is presented not in a formal argumentation structure, but is presented with all of al-Jāḥiẓ's literary flair, for which he is well known. He's also accused of being digressive. I think that accusation is a bit exaggerated, but And you will probably object, I'm guessing. We can find out in the Q&A, but I'm guessing you might object that al-Jāḥiẓ doesn't intend to make this formal argument. And so why are we using something like argumentation analysis? He's not writing in syllogisms or even thinking in syllogisms. He's not even that concerned with the kinds of argumentation procedures that many of the mutakallimun, the disputers of his day, were concerned with. And I would agree with you on that. So I'm not trying to make any of those assumptions. But what I am assuming is that al-Jāḥiẓ is an artful persuader. And like most other persuaders, he begins from points that his audience already believes. He takes steps that his audience is likely to find plausible, and he navigates around objections that they raise. And so his argumentation is informal, but it is still argumentation. Now, before we go into the content of al-Jāḥiẓ's argumentation, let me just explain the steps in an analytic overview according to this approach. So the first step is to determine the points at issue, then to recognize the positions that the speaker adopts and any positions that he attributes to his opponents. Thirdly, to identify the explicit arguments and to make any of the implicit arguments explicit. And there's a certain procedure for that step as well, which is a very important one. And finally, to analyze the structure of the speaker's argumentation. If we look at it in a diagram form, this is the basic key to the diagram. So we have a standpoint, in this case, number 1, which has multiple arguments pointing to it, multiple arguments supporting this particular standpoint. There's multiple argumentation, which is when there are independent arguments supporting the standpoint. And these can have premises. I use parentheses if they're unexpressed premises. And of course, you can have sub-arguments. There's also coordinative argumentation, which looks like this with the solid lines connecting it to show that these arguments taken together support the standpoint. They may not be sufficient to stand on their own, but taken together, they support the standpoint. What I'd like to do then is to zoom in on 3 different levels of al-Jāḥiẓ's argumentation. So we start out on the broad level. First of all, we have to note that even from a cursory glance, we see some things from the structure of this text. The first thing is that if you read even in the editions, you'll see clearly marked the excerpts. This was an anthologized text, so we don't have the entire thing. We have it in an anthology that came about a century and a half at most after al-Jāḥiẓ's death. This is actually the case for most of al-Jāḥiẓ's epistles. They were preserved in this particular anthology, although there are some that were preserved elsewhere. And these excerpts, well, just a little aside here, if you're interested in the history of the text, is that the text itself, the text of this anthology went through a kind of bottleneck. We can come back to this if you're interested in it during the Q&A. I don't want to go into detail here, except to say that all of the witnesses that we have, as far as we know, were copied directly or indirectly from a manuscript dated 1013 that it has not survived, but it was last seen in the 1890s or early 1900s in Cairo. So the manuscripts that we do have are quite late, and the text has gone through this bottleneck. There is not a lot of textual variation, so what we have only varies by a matter of usually some words, sometimes some phrases. And if you're going to be working with the text, there currently is not any edition that takes into account the earliest surviving manuscript, which is the Istanbul manuscript. So the best thing you can do is to compare the editions of Finkel and of Harun to one another. And as far as translations, there is no complete academic English translation. There's a partial translation by Finkel from 1927 that has only a third of the text. There's a complete translation, but for a popular audience, by Colville in 2002, I believe. And the most accurate translation that I'm aware of is Alouche's French translation from 1939. Leaves out a couple of very small portions of the text, but I would recommend that one. But coming back to the structure of the work, if you look at this diagram, you see the solid blue lines horizontally are the places where there are breaks in the text, according to the marked excerpts. And again, this is something we could come back to in the Q&A. I think there's a kind of ring structure going on here, but and there are some places where we can even conjecture where certain parts of the text that are mentioned in the introduction, where they might have actually been in the original text. But the most important point here is Roman numeral 2, which is al-Jāḥiẓ's social argumentation. And what's critical is that it is sandwiched between his theological argumentation. So he introduces the text by mentioning a number of questions that Christians have put to Muslims. All of these questions are actually attacks on the integrity of the Quran. But then, before answering those, he gives a large section of social critique. And what I think is going on here is that this is his attempt to undermine Christians' credibility before he actually takes on their theological arguments. And he does a number of interesting rhetorical things here. He keeps his readers in suspense while they're waiting for these burning answers to the burning questions about the Quran. Here I differ then with the view of Charles Pella, who is one of the great experts of al-Jāḥiẓ. He inventorized the works of al-Jāḥiẓ, translated many portions of them. But Pella tries to draw a very sharp division between the social critique and the theological critique. So he says that on the one hand, the socio-political level, al-Jāḥiẓ's arguments may be relevant, they may be justified, but when it comes to what he calls the dogmatic level or the theological level, he thinks really that Christians' arguments didn't pose a threat at this time to Islam. So he says, just as Voltaire used Islam against Christianity, so also Jāḥiẓ, but with different intentions, used the example of Jesus' teachings and the way they had been interpreted to stigmatize the methods employed by the Muslim fuqaha. When he says he wants to show Christians their own contradictions, the weaknesses of their doctrines and the inconsistency of their religion, and adds, the Christians claim that reasoning by analogy cannot be used for knowing dogma and that religion does not allow for free speculation. For them, faith consists of unconditionally acknowledging the content of Scripture and imitating the ancestors in a servile way. One senses that his intention is not so much to demean the followers of an attractive but now harmless religion, as much as to make clear by this approach that taqlid, or blind imitation, must be rejected and free intellectual speculation be accepted into the sphere of Islam itself. So Pella is calling Christianity a harmless religion at this stage already in the 9th century. Now, I think by the time we finish today, it will be apparent that this was not the view that al-Jāḥiẓ took, that Christianity is a harmless religion. Pella's point is that he's inserting some jabs, some Mu'tazilite jabs, but still, I think the theological and the social argumentation has to be seen together. Well, if we zero in then, zoom in on the social argumentation, and we look at what are al-Jāḥiẓ's standpoints, how does he explicitly take this on? His first standpoint is that the reasons the Muslim masses have for considering Christians less harmful than Jews are ill-founded. Let me read this excerpt and then we'll get to this question of why does he do this. He says, this is how he introduces the section. I will begin with an account of the causes of the Christians becoming more liked by the masses than the Zoroastrians, perceived among them as more open-minded than the Jews, closer in friendship, less malicious, less unbelieving, and less troubling. The causes of this are many, and its reasons apparent, such that anyone who has thought about it can perceive them, but whoever has not will remain ignorant of them. Now, there's an allusion here, which he makes explicit later, to Quran 582, al-Ma'idah, in which there's a famous verse about Christians being closest in friendship. And what al-Jāḥiẓ does with a kind of rhetorical trick, al-Jāḥiẓ is known for setting up a debate between two things, munāẓara, and using even the ancient Mesopotamian forms maybe, to set up this debate between two things, and especially helping the underdog to win this kind of debate. So everybody thinks, okay, Christians, of course, they're better than Jews. According to him, that's what everybody thinks, and the Quran even supports it, and he goes about then overturning that opinion. So the first thing he does is to look at the historical causes, as he says, so really to undermine the reasons that people would have for preferring Christians. But then his second standpoint is then specifically to argue that Christians harm our community more than Jews. He introduces this by saying, now we, may God have mercy on you, do not disagree with the masses concerning how wealthy the Christians are, that they have prominent authority, that their clothing is cleaner, or that their professions are better. Where we differ, rather, is about the difference between the two forms of unbelief, the two sects, regarding the extent of their obstinacy and importunity, their lying in wait for the people of Islam, using every kind of trickery with vile manners and malicious by nature. In a diagram, we could represent it this way. So this is just an overview of what I see as 5 arguments used together to support this idea that Christians harm the community more than Jews. And we're going to focus in on the first of these. But as you can see, this is very wide-ranging. First, he talks about Christians overstepping their stipulated role, Christians being responsible for confusing weak Muslims with heresy. On top of that, there are more of them than any of the other communities, and they castrate people more cruelly than anybody else does, and they have more impurities than the Jews do. So in some of these places where you'll see in parentheses, I put it in parentheses because I'm summarizing where his argument is leading to. But you'll see that the whole argument relies on this kind of comparison between Christians and other communities. But if we zoom in one level further, so we zoom in on this 2.1a, why does he say Christians more than Jews overstep their stipulated role with impunity? Well, the argument has to do with not only Christians' actions themselves, but also the unsound rulings of judges. And what is implied here is that this is not the same level of problem with the Jewish community. Either they don't overstep their role to the same extent, or else they don't receive the same kind of leniency in Muslim courts. But in any case, apparently his reasoning is that the more a community, a dhimmi community, oversteps this role, the more it harms the Muslim community. So if we zoom in then on these 2 points about Christians' own actions and about the way that they are dealt with in Muslim courts, in Islamic courts, we have, let me just quote here, his description of how Christians do this. As for their prominence, professions, and appearance, we know that they acquire horses that are Arabian crosses and swift steeds, hire bands of horse pasturers, play polo, cut their hair in the Medinan fashion, wear blended silk fabrics and double-layered tunics, hire guards, name themselves al-Hasan, al-Hussein, al-Abbas, al-Fadl, and Ali, and also use all of these as kunyas. The only thing left is for them to name themselves Muhammad and use the kunya Abul Qasim. Thus, Muslims are fond of them, and many of the Christians leave off wearing their zunnar waistbands, while others tie them on underneath their robes. Many of their well-to-do refuse to hand over the poll tax, the jizya, and despite their wealth scorn paying it. They insult anyone who insults them and strike those who strike them. What is going on here? There's a lot that's implied, a lot that's stated about their actions, but why are these actions a problem? And al-Jāḥiẓ is going to come in just a little bit to the dhimmi agreements with, that are the pacts of protection with Muslims. Now, this has been a major point of debate in the last years. You can look especially at the book of Milka Levy-Rubin, which has a very useful exploration of this question. There's of course, the famous Pact of Umar, but there's the question, when did this Pact of Umar become really a thing? There are the claims, of course, that it goes back to Umar, but what we have in actual practice is evidence of many pacts of protection with dhimmi communities, many different pacts of protection with dhimmi communities that at some point become generalized. And Milka Levy-Rubin argues that it's around this time and has partly to do with the actions of al-Mutawakkil, who is enforcing some of these things against the dhimmi communities, that this Pact of Umar becomes a more generalized thing. And so we have a snapshot here in al-Jāḥiẓ, who doesn't say explicitly there are one pact or there are many, but who assumes that there are some kinds of agreements that dhimmi peoples are subject to, and who also assumes that it's not necessary to say, well, the people of this place or of that place or of that place have this stipulation. No, it should be obvious these things apply to all dhimmi people. And so some specific things here are the ways that Christians show their humility, or should show them their humility, essentially, how they're paying the poll tax, and they're retaliating Muslims' blows and insults. And as we'll see, these are things that are taken up also by jurists who are working on these pacts. And then we get to this issue of the judges, the Muslim jurists, Islamic judges who do not enforce these, according to al-Jāḥiẓ, in the way that they should be enforced. Why would they not do this and more when our judges, or at least the unsophisticated ones, consider the blood of the patriarch or metropolitan or bishop to be equivalent to the blood of Jafar or Ali or al-Abbas or Hamza? They think that a Christian who slanders the mother of the prophet, claiming she is in a state of perdition, should only get discretionary punishment and discipline, and they justify this by saying, by the fact that the mother of the prophet was not a Muslim. May God exalted be praised, how incredible this statement is and how obviously jumbled. There are a couple more quotes on the following slides, which you can look at yourself as he continues this argument. It's quite an extended argument. For the sake of time, though, I'll just summarize that he goes on to say, look, when you write down a pact of protection with the dhimmi communities, you don't have to say, don't slander the mother of the prophet. It should be obvious, because their lives are being spared by this pact of protection. So this should be an obvious point. The diagram for this is quite complicated because his argument here is so involved, but it has to do with some unstated premises about the way that unstated expectations, if you break an unstated expectation in a covenant, that annuls it, and this should have major consequences. And of course, you can't just give light punishments to people when they commit serious offenses. So his reasoning is not legal juristic reasoning. And he very oddly uses a weak hadith here. He doesn't generally use hadith, but he very oddly brings in a weak hadith to support his point. But what we see from this is that he is trying to tackle the same issue that from a level of enforcement, al-Mutawakkil himself with 2 decrees is also trying to do around the same time, and that the jurists who are closest in time to al-Jāḥiẓ are also taking up. So if we look at the kinds of stipulations that we see in the genre that we might call Pact of Umar, and we compare some jurists, Abu Yusuf Ashafi ibn Hanbal, with the edicts of al-Mutawakkil as preserved in 2 different sources, and what al-Jāḥiẓ has to say here, we see that there's an overlap of almost every item between what al-Jāḥiẓ mentions, even when he doesn't say specifically this has to do with a dhimmi pact, but there's an overlap of almost every item with the ways that these things are treated in the other sources. So al-Jāḥiẓ is then taking the approach of trying to persuade a popular or semi-popular audience to circumvent the juristic ideas about this. So coming to the conclusion here, what did al-Jāḥiẓ then not want to admit? What do we glean from all this? Well, first of all, the fact that there were apparently large Muslim factions in 9th century Iraq, which al-Jāḥiẓ calls the masses, who considered Christians in general, or at least the prominent public figures of them, to be an integral and valuable part of society. And secondly, that these prominent Christian intellectuals and administrators were relatively untouched by the dhimmi restrictions, unless those restrictions were enforced top down, as al-Mutawakkil did to a certain extent, but again, we could talk about how long-lasting those were, what exceptions he made, and so on. Thirdly, that even this kind of top-down enforcement required some kind of public support for it. This is why al-Jāḥiẓ is writing this. And if you compare what happened on the popular level with the Mihna, you realize that even a caliph like al-Mutawakkil, who wants to start putting some of these things into effect, has to get some kind of popular sympathy for them. And then finally, that juristic reasoning sometimes undermined the Islamic ideologies of exclusion that people like al-Jāḥiẓ wanted to promote over against the Islamic jurists. And the public knew this, so he had to try and bypass the jurists. Some conclusions from this have to do, first of all, with the 2 kinds of argumentation that al-Jāḥiẓ uses, which, as I've said, I think are closely tied together structurally and rhetorically. So the contra-pila, this affront of Christian kalam, was real. It had to be countered not just with theological arguments, but also with social arguments. And also, al-Jāḥiẓ had real contact with Jewish communities. So coming back to the issue of Jewish communities, he had contact with them. I wrote an article 2017 about that. But in this work, we don't get this kind of detailed information about Jewish communities in a way that we can really derive much from them, because they're mostly a point of negative comparison. And so what we can assume is that their social position was probably more similar to that of Christians than al-Jāḥiẓ admitted in his rhetorical framing, somewhere between al-Jāḥiẓ's extremely negative depiction of the Jewish communities and what he portrays as being the highly appreciated position of Christian public intellectuals. So I'm looking forward to your feedback. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for a very interesting, very insightful, and very rich talk. We have time for some questions. If you have them, you can raise your digital hand or post them in the chat. Just to set us off, maybe I have a question about the Sitz im Leben of this text.
Yeah.
As it happens, I gave a talk about intra-Christian polemics yesterday, And I talked about a case, there was entanglement with anti-Islamic polemics in that text. So I was wondering, in this case, so is this text intended just as the readership is Islamic, or is this intended to be read by Christians as well? And then secondly, does it in some way also reflect, except the social kind of polemic, is there any type of intra-Islamic polemic in this case that is also reflected in these texts? For example, theological. Is any of this reflective in this text as well?
Yeah. Thanks for that. So first of all, in regard to the Sitzung Leben and the readership, to me, it appears that it is intended for a Muslim readership. It says that explicitly in the introduction, that it's supposed to help, help the readers, help weak Muslims who are being deceived by the Christians. So it says that explicitly, but not just that. The kind of argumentation that is used here, I think, simply doesn't work with a Christian audience. I mean, it's not even trying, I think, to take on Christians where they're at. It's assuming a certain background knowledge and certain background beliefs of Muslims for the argumentation to even work. So I'm going out on a limb, but I don't really think that al-Jāḥiẓ intended this even to be read by Christians necessarily. Secondly, in terms of the intra-Islamic dispute, you see that. You see that certainly with how he takes on the jurists. He's very harsh regarding the Islamic judges. But on a theological level, he even has some intra-Mu'tazilite disputes. So in one of the later excerpts, starting in excerpt 5, I believe it is, he has a fascinating discussion, a very long discussion about the issue of adoption. And his possibly teacher, al-Nadam, a well-known Mu'tazilite, had expressed an opinion about whether adoption is possible. Some other Mu'tazilites had, and al-Jāḥiẓ takes this on and develops his own point of view, not only in relation to the Christian argument, but also in relation to the other Mu'tazilite arguments that he sees as being insufficient. So that's a fascinating and very complicated portion. And then besides that, I do think that Pala is right, that there are these kind of jabs at taqlid, at those who blindly follow tradition and so on. But it seems like al-Jāḥiẓ is a little bit less than explicit in some of these. And I think it's possible, not for certain, but possible that when he's writing these things, he's being a little bit careful about his being too flamboyantly Mu'tazilite. I'm not sure about that, but it's possible.
Okay, thank you. Georgia, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. I have several questions, but I started with one because whenever I heard excerpts, I'm like, yay, tell us more. So I was wondering if I get it correctly, the general reconstruction is that the text was excerpted once, right? And then it only circulated in that fixed form of excerpt. Yeah,
that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about the textual transmission of the text? Thank you.
Yes, sure. So we have the name of the anthologist, Ubaydullah ibn Qassan, and we don't really know anything more about him from the time that he must have lived, sometime between al-Jāḥiẓ and the first attested manuscript in 1080. From that time period, if you look in the biographical dictionaries, you find too many people named Ubaydullah ibn Qassan to really be able to determine who this is. But he excerpted, I can't remember now the number, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 or 20 of the epistles of al-Jāḥiẓ. And that collection remained intact in the various manuscript witnesses, the 4 manuscript witnesses. And I'm not sure if you were asking necessarily about the way that he did the excerpting, but to me, it appears that he left the portions of text that he excerpted, he left them fairly intact. I would tend to think that he even left them, at least in the case of the Refutation of Christians, that he even left them in the same order, because although the order is a little bit counterintuitive, that in itself, I think, would actually argue for the idea that al-Jāḥiẓ is the one who put it in this order, rather than an anthologist is not likely to just start moving things around in a way that no longer makes sense for the flow. I mean, unless he's just really careless. But it appears to me that we have the style of al-Jāḥiẓ preserved. We have a lot of his tendency is to write a sentence that is very long, that has all of these repeated phrases or clauses and so on, and that's preserved, whereas of course an anthologist could just edit a bunch of that out. So my feeling is that he's left the integrity of the text, but just taken portions, and I'm not sure how large those portions were, out. And if somebody wanted to do a study of that, the thing to do would be, there are a couple of epistles that are preserved both in the anthology and elsewhere. And one could compare. I've seen that they're quite a bit longer in the other version. I'm not sure, but off the top of my head, maybe 1.5 or more times longer. No, more than that. Anyway, at least twice as long. But it could be interesting to try and figure out the anthologist's methodology by taking those texts and comparing them. So the place to look for that would be Pelah's 1984 inventory of al-Jāḥiẓ's works, and there you'll see what the different recensions are and which epistles can be found in both.
Yeah, thank you. Just a follow-up to be sure I fully understood. When you mean preserved elsewhere, you mean indirect transmission, like quotation in other texts, or like a fuller?
Sorry, no, I mean, there are other collections of al-Jāḥiẓ epistles. And so there are a couple of other recensions of al-Jāḥiẓ epistles, which are not, as far as I know, anthologized. But they don't contain as many of the epistles. So, and they don't contain the Refutation of Christians. So that's the comparison. I mean, there's a little bit of overlap, like 2 of those, I think, overlap between the anthology and these other recensions that are preserved. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Beth, go on.
Thanks, Nathan, for this talk. I wanted to ask you about his response to the Christian critique of the Quran. So how would you explain that many of the things that he was responding to, that we don't find any parallels for this in Christian sources?
Yeah.
Well, for instance, the first thing, you actually find the opposite about Jesus speaking in the cradle. So this is, often later proof text as one of the was evidence for like Christ's special status or divinity. So are we like missing many sources from the Christian side, or is he making stuff up, or something in between? So how would you deal with this issue?
Yeah, it's a tricky issue. Like I keep wishing that I could find what his sources for this are. They don't have to be written sources, because he specifically paints the scene of Christians in conversation confronting Muslims with these problems. So it doesn't have to be a written source that he's relying on. But we do know that there were a couple of specifically refutations of the Quran written by Christians that predated al-Jāḥiẓ, predated this work. They're no longer extant, or if they are, they're we don't know where. But one of them, if I remember correctly, was by Ibrahim bin Nuh, who is closely connected to these circles that al-Jāḥiẓ was connected to. So although at first it seems a little preposterous that Christians are in that environment are really writing these very explicit critiques of the Quran, it does seem that that they existed and that he's responding to them, even if not in a written form. The arguments themselves are fascinating because, yeah, it's possible he could be using this as a kind of literary framework for addressing what maybe Muslims had also realized were problems that had to be dealt with in the Quran. That's totally possible. Ibn Qutayba famously accuses al-Jāḥiẓ of giving evidence for his opponents that is too strong and confusing people with it. So it's possible that he did something like that. However, I don't think that's always the case because, for example, this extended argument that I mentioned about adoption, when you start taking apart the pieces of that, it actually really fits into a kind of Christian argument against the Quran, not as Christians being adoptionists Christologically, but saying, in this case, if God could take Abraham as a friend, Khalil, then why could he not take a son also? When you get into the details of that argument, the quotations that he gives from the Old and New Testaments in the course of making that argument and so on, to me, it seems apparent that there is some kind of Christian argument behind this.
I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of responses or the impact of this work, you've talked about how it's transmitted in these excerpt collections and in other manuscripts. Was there any? Did this argument have any impact on the ground? Did things actually change? Did nothing change? Or in physical? I mean, as far from a social aspect for Christians themselves. And I think you just mentioned just in your answer to Beth, someone's response, a Muslim's response to him anyway. Is there anything more in this regard?
Yeah, there's a little bit, but not much. One of the fascinating things about this text is its uniqueness. As you may know, it's so common for polemics to be, the arguments from polemics to be recycled over and over again. And there's so much about this text that is really unique, especially the social dimension, but also the theological portion of it. So as far as whether it made a difference on the ground, it's a tricky question because, as someone once put to me, there's the chicken and egg problem. Which came first, al-Mutawakkil's reforms or al-Jāḥiẓ's refutation? What connection did they have to each other? And it's just really not clear. We can't date the refutation precisely enough to figure out which one came first. But all we know is that around this time, there's both the effort from the caliph to enforce certain regulations and this effort from al-Jāḥiẓ to make a popular argument that there should be this kind of these kinds of restrictions on Dhimmi peoples. So on the ground, as far as we know that al-Mutawakkil's edicts really had quite an effect at the time, but probably not very long lasting. And the things that al-Mutawakkil tried to implement had to be re-implemented over and over again in later generations. As far as the reception of the work, the main place where I see it picked up, as far as I've found, and I'm very happy for anybody who's seen other things, but as far as I found, the main place where it's picked up is in regard to al-Jāḥiẓ's criticism of celibacy, which, not surprisingly, certain Christian authors respond to, including Bar Ebroyo responds to this. But in Muslim circles, it doesn't seem to have had that much of an effect or to have been recycled that much as far as I can tell. The main person being Abdul Jabbar, partly depending on what you think the authenticity of the works attributed to him is, but anyway, the works attributed to Abdul Jabbar, including the Mughni has very extended portion summarizing and reframing the argument of al-Jāḥiẓ about adoption. And then, interestingly, this is taken up by Saadia Gaon, who I think maybe misunderstands, maybe Abdul Jabbar himself has misunderstood as well, but Saadia Gaon thinks that it's talking about a group of Christians who are adoptionist in their Christology, which I don't think is actually the case, but Saadia Gaon is reading either Abdul Jabbar or al-Jāḥiẓ and picks this up. But I've really found very few places where this gets any kind of reception in, for example, Muslim polemical literature.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Maybe just, well, yeah, Dan, go on.
Hey, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I'm just curious how this text fits among other polemical treatises of the same period, broadly speaking. Yeah. Are they also speaking more to themselves rather than to the other? Do you feel that this one has the arguments of the Christians that he's debating are more scholarly or more reflective of a discussion he had in a coffee shop, so more of a straw man than other polemical treatises of the time? I'm curious how this situates broadly. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's an important question. There are other polemics from around this time. One of the most important ones being the refutation by al-Tabari, Ibn Rabban al-Tabari, who probably converted from the Church of the East to Islam under the reign of al-Mutawakkil, was a physician. And when we look at his refutation as well as his other book, his Kitab ad-Din wa Dawla, a book of empire and religion, if you like, however that should be translated, Tabari takes a completely different approach, totally different. Tabari basically wants to use the Christian scriptures as proof texts for Muhammad and so on, as he wants to take the Christian scriptures and use them apologetically to demonstrate Islam. I haven't studied al-Tabari enough to know to what extent his audience might have found a Christian readership, but I could well imagine that kind of argument has some applicability to Christians, to Christian readers, much more so, I would think, than what al-Jāḥiẓ is doing. There are other refutations that are very theological, very kalam-oriented, really erudite in their philosophical argumentation. Al-Jāḥiẓ is not that kind of writer. He doesn't probably seem to be that kind of thinker. He's much more of a colorful literary person who has, I think his argumentation has been neglected, but he's not arguing on that kind of kalam level. And so also then when he gets into most of these theological questions, he's not taking it to the same extent the way that he gets into it logically. But with the exception of this passage about adoption, I would say, is an exception to that. So he's much more interested, compared to other writings, he's much more interested in the social aspect. He's the first of the polemicists who give us this kind of social picture. And Abdul Jabbar takes that up later. You can take a look at Reynolds and in Critique of Christian Origins. But yeah, it's quite a unique work, even in its particular context of the 9th century Islamic refutations of Christianity. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.
I have another a minor question. You brought this up, I think, in an answer to someone that he's also quoting from the Bible. I'm not sure if it was Old and or New Testament. Have you figured out, because I'm not a specialist in this at all, in Arabic translation of the Bible, but there are various translations. So have you been able to try and figure out if it's a Christian translation, if it's Old Testament, if it's a Jewish translation? Have you been able to trace these kind of citations, or maybe to a specific collection?
Yeah. I haven't traced all of them, but what he does is he goes through a number of proof texts that most of his citations in this work of the Bible are instances where he says they are bad Jewish translations, bad in the sense that they're anthropomorphizing. And he says you can't say these things about God in Arabic. He sees it as a linguistic problem. He doesn't know Hebrew, presumably, but he sees this as a translation problem. You can't say these things about God in Arabic. And fascinatingly, he says that the Torah in its, presumably he means in its Hebrew original, is the word of God. So according to him, the problem is only in the translation. Now, I did study the passages that he takes from Isaiah, which is, he takes a long section from Isaiah 42. And it is quite clear that that comes ultimately from a Hebrew source rather than via Syriac or via Greek, and probably not, in my opinion, probably not even via the Targumim, not the Jewish Aramaic translations, but actually in some form from a Hebrew source. This is quite early for that. I mean, this is before Sa'adia. It wouldn't be the absolute earliest, but it's quite early, and it leads to the question of, did he have a written source? Did he have an oral source for this? This is what makes me think he was actually in contact with Jewish communities. At that time, it would be absolutely normal for any translation, Arabic translation of the Hebrew Bible to be written in Hebrew characters, so in Judeo-Arabic, which makes it all the more likely that he has an oral source for this. And the source reflects something of in the direction of the mirror translation techniques that are known from other non-Saadianic Jewish Arabic Bible translations. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. All right. If anyone has a question, now is the time to ask. Last chance. No. All right. That leaves me to thank Nathan for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you
Good
very
seeing
much,
everyone.
everybody.
Thanks.
See you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.